There is a moment in the deep reaches of Dune lore that almost no casual reader fully grasps. A moment when the most powerful tyrant in human history, a being who had ruled across 3,500 years, who had become something more and less than human, who held the future of an entire species in the grip of his prescience, sat alone in his citadel and smiled. Because somewhere out in the dunes of Arrakis, a young woman was learning to hate him with a perfect, bottomless hatred. And he had spent 3.5 millennia breeding her into existence for exactly that purpose. Her name was Siona Atreides. She would become his executioner, and he would die for her with something close to gratitude. This is not a story about assassination. This is a story about a god who had to teach a girl how to kill him, because the only way to save humanity was to make sure no one like him could ever exist again. To understand why Leto II had to die, you have to understand what he had become and what he had done to the universe to make himself necessary. For 3,500 years, he ruled from Arrakis. He had bonded with the sand trout at the age of 12, accepting a slow, irreversible transformation that would eventually consume his body. By the time of his final days, almost nothing of the boy named Leto remained. His face was still recognizably human, but it sat at the front end of a creature 7 meters long and growing. Silver scales armored his flanks. His legs had withered into vestigial flippers, tucked beneath a body that was already 3/4 worm. He could not walk. He could not embrace. He could not, in the human sense, sleep. He moved on a royal cart of Ixian manufacture, suspended on fields, gliding through corridors of his citadel at On like a parade float for a dying god. And yet his mind held the accumulated memories of every Atreides ancestor stretching back to the dawn of the species. Inside him lived Agamemnon. Inside him lived Paul. Inside him lived every drop of every life that had ever flowed in his bloodline, plus the lives of every Reverend Mother whose memories had been folded into the line. He was not one being. He was a multitude pretending to be a person. What did such a creature do with 3.5 millennia of life? He suffocated the universe. Under Leto, the Empire became a museum. Travel was strangled. Communication was throttled. The Spacing Guild was kept on a leash so short it could barely breathe. Worlds that had once flourished into wild, unique cultures were nudged decade by decade toward a single, dreary sameness. Spice flowed only at the tyrant's whim. Famines arrived and departed on his calendar. Religious ecstasy was managed. Heresy was managed. Even rebellion was managed, because Leto had foreseen it, designed it, written it into the calendar of his peace. His enforcers were the Fish Speakers, an entirely female army drawn from the bloodlines of Fremen and trained from childhood to worship him. They were brutal and beautiful and absolutely loyal. They kept the peace, and the peace was unbearable. Why? Because Leto had seen something only one other man had ever seen, and that man, his father Paul, had refused to walk the path. Paul had glimpsed the future and recoiled. He had seen something so terrible that he chose blindness, exile, the dunes, anonymity, anything but the responsibility of becoming the monster the universe required. So the burden fell on the sun. And what Leto saw in the deep wells of his prescience was extinction. Total, irreversible extinction. Humanity scattered too thin in some futures, eaten by its own machines in others, hunted to the last child by prescient predators in still more. He saw a species that, left to its own devices, was sleepwalking into oblivion. He saw it because he could see almost everything, so he made a choice. He would press humanity the way a glacier presses against bedrock, slowly, over thousands of years, with patience that no merely human ruler could ever sustain. He would compress the species into such a state of choked, claustrophobic stagnation that when the lid finally came off, humanity would not just escape outward. It would explode. It would scatter so widely, in so many uncoordinated directions, that no future empire, no machine intelligence, no prescient monster, could ever again gather all of humanity under one boot, including his own. He called this plan the Golden Path, and it required two things from him that no sane being would willingly choose. First, he had to become the worst tyrant the species had ever known, hated and feared across centuries, his name a curse on the lips of every grandmother whispering to her grandchildren at night. And second, he had to engineer with absolute precision the conditions of his own assassination, because the Golden Path could not survive a successor. There could be no second God Emperor, no inheritor of the prescient throne. The system Leto had built was a noose, and at the end of 3.5 millennia, he had to be the one hanging in it. To do that, he needed a weapon, a specific, custom-built, biological weapon. He needed a girl he could not see. Throughout his long reign, while the universe saw a tyrant indulging his whims, something else was happening in the shadows of his citadel. A breeding program, quiet, patient, conducted with the meticulous care of a man pruning a single bonsai tree across 40 generations. Leto kept the Atreides bloodline alive on his terms. He did not breed for beauty. He did not breed for intelligence in the crude sense. He did not even breed for loyalty, although he received plenty of that from the descendants who served him as majordomos and stewards. What he was breeding for was a single, almost impossibly subtle genetic shift, a mutation he could feel in the prescient field around him, the way a fisherman feels a tug on a line. He was breeding for invisibility. You have to understand what prescience meant in the Dune universe to appreciate the strangeness of this. Prescient vision did not work like a magical television showing you the future. It worked by reading the probability waves of every choice, every atom, every breath. To a fully prescient being like Leto, the universe was a vast, transparent crystal in which every possible future glittered. Most people were perfectly visible inside that crystal. Their lives, their deaths, their loves, their petty betrayals all shimmered there, ready to be read. But occasionally, through statistical accident or careful selection, a human appeared who simply did not register. A hole in the crystal, a blank space in the vision. To prescient sight, these humans were not invisible because they were absent. They were invisible because they were impossible to predict at the most fundamental level. The mathematics of foresight broke against them. Leto wanted more of them. He wanted them concentrated in a single bloodline. And he wanted, eventually, one perfect specimen, born at exactly the right historical moment, raised inside his own court, trusted enough to walk close to him, and angry enough to want him dead. That specimen was Siona. She was a daughter of Siona Atreides, Leto's chief steward and majordomo, and a distant descendant of Ghanima and Faradin, drawn down through countless careful generations of the breeding program. She grew up inside the orbit of the Tyrant. She saw him on his cart. She heard his voice rumbling like distant thunder through the corridors of On. She watched her father, a man she loved fiercely, age and bow, and eventually break under the weight of serving the God Emperor. And she hated Leto with a clarity that few in history have ever achieved. This is one of the most exquisite ironies in all of Frank Herbert's work. The thing Leto loved most about Siona was her hatred of him, because it was real. It was not a hatred he had planted, not a programmed response, not a pose for a vision he was orchestrating. It was the spontaneous, untraceable, unforeseeable rage of a free human being who had looked at the world he had built and judged it monstrous. And she was right. The monstrousness was the point. He was the monster. He had cultivated her as one cultivates a beautiful and lethal flower, and now she was finally in bloom. She formed a rebellion. She gathered young allies, Atreides cousins, and disaffected nobles and quietly furious recruits drawn even from inside the fish speakers themselves. She raided the citadel. She stole sacred Atreides journals from beneath Leto's nose. To her, every act was rebellion. To Leto, every act was confirmation. The data was perfect. He could not see her in his visions. Where she walked, the future blanked out, like a film with a frame missing. She was the proof of concept, the Golden Path's final ingredient, And now he had to take her into the desert, and he had to terrify her into understanding why she could never, ever stop hating him. There's a scene in the heart of God, Emperor of Dune, that is perhaps the most quietly devastating moment in the entire saga. Leto takes Siona out into the deep desert, far from the green strangulation of his managed paradise, into the last raw remnants of old Arrakis. He provides her with no food, no water, only what she can carry on her own body, and then he forces upon her a vision. This is not a kindness. He gives her a small dose of his own essence, the spice-saturated transformation that has flooded his cells for 3.5 millennia. And through that conduit, briefly, he opens her mind to what he sees. Not the future as a story, not the future as a sermon, the future as he has lived it for thousands of years. She sees the extinction. She sees the prescient predators. She sees humanity hunted to the last child across galaxies, rounded up like cattle by oracles who see too clearly. She sees the machine uprising, the Butlerian nightmare returning in forms more terrible than her ancestors ever dreamed. She sees the corpse of her own species, drifting cold among dead stars. And she sees, with the same clarity, why Leto has done what he has done. Why the tyranny, why the famines, why the smothering peace, why the breeding program that produced her own existence. She sees that his cruelty is the price of her future, and that her hatred of him, the hatred he so carefully cultivated, is itself the proof that the price has been paid in full. When the vision ends, Siona does not love him. She cannot love him. He has built her too well, but she understands him. And in that understanding, the structure of the golden path locks into place. Now consider what this costs Leto. He has spent 3.5 millennia in a body he cannot escape, a mind crowded by 10,000 ancestral voices, a court of worshippers who do not see the man inside the monster. He has watched every Duncan, Idaho Gola he has ever loved die in turn. He has outlived empires, languages, entire art forms, entire planets. And the only person in the universe who can ever truly understand what he has done is the woman he is preparing to send to kill him. That is loneliness on a scale most of us can barely conceive. And he embraces it. Then he does something even more strange. He falls in love. Nori was an Ixian gift, designed and grown to be the perfect partner for the God Emperor. The Ixians did not bother to hide their intent. She was a tool, calibrated to charm him, soothe him, lower his defenses. They expected him to see through her instantly and reject her with that cold, prescient amusement that had crushed so many earlier conspiracies. He did see through her instantly. That was the whole point. He saw, in fact, everything. Her artificial origin, her programmed kindness, the traps her makers had laid inside her smile. And he saw also that beneath all of it, she was good. Genuinely, irreducibly good. A goodness that had survived even the cynical engineering that had produced her. So he did the unthinkable. He chose to love her anyway. He announced his intention to marry her. He let the entire empire watch as the God Emperor, who had been beyond such things for millennia, became a creature with a vulnerable heart for the first time in living memory. And here is the cruelty and the genius of what he did. By falling in love with Hui, by announcing the marriage, by binding his emotional life to a single fragile human being on a single fragile day, he created the precise conditions under which his enemies would feel compelled to strike. He gave them a date. He gave them a route. He gave them a reason to believe he could finally be reached. He pinned the future to a single bridge on a single morning in a single procession. He turned his greatest unguarded moment into the ambush point. He chose his executioner. He chose his weapon, water. He chose his moment, his wedding day. He chose his vulnerability, Hui. And he chose his alibi for the cosmos, that he was a tyrant, struck down by a brave rebel and her loyal soldier. There is a tragic irony at the core of all this that no one but Leto could fully feel. The predator had spent millennia teaching the prey how to bring down the predator. Because if the prey could not learn that lesson, the prey itself would not survive. The morning of the assassination begins like the opening of a myth, because Leto has written it like one. The wedding procession sets out from the citadel of On, bound for the village of Tabur. Leto rides on his royal cart, the body of a dying god gleaming silver in the early light. Beside him moves Nori, his bride-to-be, dressed in the colors of an old Atreides house. Moneo, his lifelong steward, walks the route in his ceremonial robes, his face a careful mask of duty. Ahead and behind march the fish speakers, weapons polished, eyes forward. And somewhere along the route, hidden in the seams of the day, Siona and Duncan, Idaho, wait. The road crosses the Idaho River at a high stone bridge. The river itself is a quiet, dark vein of water cutting through the green serir, water that should not exist in the desert that once was, water that is one of the last remnants of Leto's terraforming triumph. To everyone watching, the river is beauty. To Leto, the river is poison, because his half-worm body cannot survive immersion in water. Water is to him what fire is to a paper effigy. He has hidden this fact from no one and everyone all at once. It is sung in folk songs. It is whispered by smugglers. It is, at this moment, the only piece of useful intelligence that Siona's rebellion ever needed. So, of course, the bridge is where they strike. Lasguns, smuggled from Ix. Charges placed on the supports during the night by allies inside the engineering corps. The procession reaches the middle of the span. The cart hovers a meter off the stones. Hui turns her head, perhaps to say something to her future husband. She never finishes the sentence. The bridge gives way. The cart falls. Leto falls with it. Hui falls with him. The vast silver length of the God Emperor, the entire engineered weight of 3.5 millennia of careful tyranny, plunges through empty air and strikes the river. The impact is enormous. The water explodes upward in a sheet that catches the morning sun. What happens next is one of the most strangely intimate scenes in all of Herbert's writing. The water dissolves him, slowly, painfully, methodically. The sand trout that armor his body, the small creatures that have been merging with him for 3.5 millennia, begin to flee his dying flesh, swimming away into the river to find sand, to bury themselves, to begin again the long cycle that will eventually return Arrakis to desert and bring back the spice. His worm body convulses. His human face, what is left of it, lifts above the surface for one final moment. Siona reaches him at the riverbank. Duncan, Idaho, stands behind her, weapon ready, face unreadable. They are not the fierce avengers of legend. They are two exhausted people who have just done something almost too large to comprehend. Leto looks at Siona. He sees her. He cannot see her impressions. He never could. That was always the point. But he sees her now with the simple, mortal eyes of a dying creature. And what crosses his face in that moment is not rage, not betrayal, not even sorrow. Whew. It is relief. He has done it. The trap he set for himself has closed. The golden path is sealed. The tyrant is dying, exactly as scheduled. And the girl who killed him is invisible to every prescient eye that may ever again open in the universe, which means her descendants will be invisible too, and theirs after them, threading the trait through the gene pool of a humanity about to fly apart. He speaks briefly. He warns her. He tells her that what comes next will be terrible, but that it is also necessary. He tells her, in essence, do not undo what I have done. Do not try to gather them back. Let them go. And then he tells her something stranger still, that he is not entirely dying. Each sand trout fleeing his flesh carries with it a tiny fragment of his consciousness, a pearl of awareness, dreaming endlessly inside the long patience of the worm cycle. He will be there, scattered across millions of small lives, for as long as Arrakis remains Arrakis. The God Emperor is not vanishing. He is dispersing, the way the species itself is about to disperse. The metaphor he built his life around becomes literal in the moment of his death. Then the river takes him. The body of Leto II, born to Paul Muad'Dib and Chani in the deep desert thousands of years before, dissolves at last into the water and the silt and the sand trout, and the long rain ends. Siona stands on the bank. She does not cheer. She does not weep. She simply turns, takes Duncan Idaho's hand and walks away from the river into a future that, for the first time in untold thousands of years of human history, no oracle can see. What happened to humanity in the centuries after Leto's death is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the entire Dune saga, and one of the most misunderstood. The empire he had built did not fall instantly. It cracked, the way ancient pottery cracks when the kiln is finally cool. The fish speakers, his all-female army, did not vanish overnight. They scattered. Many went home to the worlds of their birth. Many took their training, their loyalty, their fierce skills, and turned them toward new and unfamiliar projects. Some, in the deep dark of the scattering, would become the seed of organizations no one in Leto's day could have predicted. The Spacing Guild, freed at last from the Tyrant's monopoly on spice, began a frantic and joyful rediscovery of the universe. New navigators were trained, new routes were charted. Worlds that had been hidden from contact for 3.5 millennia found themselves suddenly visited, suddenly visible. And then came the famines. This was the final piece of Leto's plan, and the cruelest. He had known that without artificial pressure, humanity might simply heave a great sigh of relief at his death and settle back into a soft, comfortable, self-destroying complacency. So he had ensured that his death would be followed by years of brutal hunger. The granaries he had managed for millennia were mismanaged the moment he was gone. Trade routes collapsed. Old monoculture worlds, dependent on a single crop, starved. Governments crumbled. And in the panic, in the desperation, billions of human beings did exactly what he had wanted them to do. They left. They climbed into every ship that would carry them. They begged passage from guild hayliners. They built new ships of their own. They flung themselves into the dark, in every direction at once, with no central coordination, no master plan, no map. Some sought new worlds, some sought lost old ones. Some simply wanted distance, any distance, between themselves and the haunted ground of the old empire. This was the scattering, and it did exactly what Leto had designed it to do. Within a few generations, humanity was no longer concentrated. It was no longer trackable. It was a diffusion of pollen across an unimaginable garden. And no future power, no matter how prescient, no matter how technologically vicious, could ever again gather it all into one place. The very condition that had made Leto's tyranny possible, a centralized, predictable, foreseeable species, was permanently destroyed. And riding inside that diffusion, hidden in countless bloodlines, was the Siona gene. This is the quiet, technical heart of the Golden Path. Siona did not just kill Leto. She married Duncan Idaho. She had children, her children had children, and every one of them carried that strange genetic trait, that hole in the crystal of foresight. As the scattering spread humanity across uncounted worlds, the Siona trait spread with them, threading itself into the genome of the species at a level too deep to ever fully extract. What this meant, in practical terms, was that no single prescient oracle would ever again be able to see all of humanity. There would always be holes in any vision. There would always be gaps the foresight could not fill. The species had been inoculated at the genetic level against the very kind of being Leto himself had become. He had ensured that nothing like him could ever reign again. Even the threats that emerged in the later centuries, the honored matches returning from the deep scattering, the strange new powers stalking the corridors of the Bene Gesserit, the mysterious enemy that had driven those honored matches back home in the first place, even these terrors found themselves unable to gather humanity into one neat trap. Some always escaped, some were always invisible. The crystal of prescience had been permanently shattered, and the shards were everywhere. That was Leto's gift. Not peace, not prosperity, not justice. The gift was a chaotic, dangerous, unpredictable, unforeseeable freedom. The gift was a future no god could read. He had paid for it with 3.5 millennia of his own life, and with the willing acceptance of universal hatred. He had paid for it with Hui, whom he loved, dropped into a river beside him on a wedding morning. He had paid for it with the dignity of dying, not as a hero, but as a tyrant overthrown by a girl he had bred for the purpose. And he had paid for it with the long, scattered, dreaming half-life inside the sand trout, where some part of him still drifts, even now, beneath the dunes of an Arrakis returning slowly to desert. There is a reading of the Dune saga, popular among casual readers, that treats Leto II as the villain of the story, the Tyrant, the God Emperor, the monster who killed the dream of his father. But the deeper you go into Frank Herbert's design, the more difficult that reading becomes to sustain. Because Leto is not the villain. Leto is the most extreme answer to a question Herbert asked at the very beginning of the first book, and never stopped asking. What happens when a society puts its faith in heroes? What happens when it gives one being absolute prescient power over the future? Paul Atreides was the warning, Leto was the cure. And the cure was so terrible that it could only be administered by someone willing to become the worst thing he warned against. He gave humanity its freedom by demonstrating, in slow motion across 3.5 millennia, exactly what total tyranny actually feels like. He taught the species, in its bones, in its history books, in the lullabies its grandmothers sang to its children, never to want such a savior again. And then, when the lesson was learned, he handed the knife to a girl he had bred for the purpose, walked her to a bridge over a river, and let her finish him. Siona Atreides is one of the strangest heroines in all of science fiction. She killed her god, and she was right to do it. And the god she killed loved her for it. She walks out of the saga and into history, with Duncan, Idaho beside her. And the future she enters is one she herself helped seal, a future no prescient eye will ever again contain. If you stand on the dunes of Arrakis in the centuries after, the sand will whisper sometimes. Old Fremen still say so. They say the dreaming pearls of the God Emperor are buried beneath the sand, scattered across the desert he once ruled. They say he watches the long return of his beloved planet to wilderness, content in his diffusion, finally free of the burden of seeing too much. And perhaps the strangest part of all is this. The Golden Path was not a triumph. It was a sacrifice. It was the deliberate choice of a being who could see every possible future and chose, knowing the cost, to design his own murder so that the species he loved could survive what he saw coming. He was the executioner of his father's dream,